So this is my second instalment of my Introduction to English Language Paper 2, picking up where the previous video left off after having covered questions 1 and 2. This video now covers questions 3 and 4. So we'll start with question 3 here. Now you see again that the number of marks available for this question has risen slightly from 8 marks for question 2. This one is now worth 12. And the timing for this one would be around about 15 minutes, something like that. That will be the proportion of your time to spend on it. Now, the first thing to state about this question is that it's very similar to English Language Paper 1, Question 2. Very, very similar indeed, in the sense that it asks you about the use of language that the writer uses. And if we look down at the question at the bottom of this slide, the example question, you'll see there it says you now need to refer only to source A from lines 27 to 40. And the question, how does the writer use language to describe the coal tips? So, first of all, you'll see clearly that this question only asks you about one source. It will give you a specific area to talk about, and once again, I would advise you that you put a box around the area for this question, so that it's clear where you're actually looking for answers. Obviously, anything that you say that refers to outside of that selected area will get you no marks, and if a part of your answer is from that, then that means that there will be an overall sort of averaged out drop in what you get for the whole answer. Now, some of the papers use slightly different areas, so it might draw your attention to a section of text. It might potentially even be as big as the whole text, but the instruction will be clear in the question. If you read the question, it won't be a problem. Now, the first half of the actual question itself, how does the writer use language, will always be the same, and then it's just the ending of the question that will differ depending on what part of the text is referred to. So, now that we've looked at what the question will look like, let's go back up to the top of this page and we'll look at my suggestions for how to answer it. As I've said, this shouldn't be too difficult because it is very similar to things that you've done before, but nonetheless we'll look at it. So, this is very similar to Language Paper 1 Question 2. However, unlike Paper 1 Question 2, it asks you to analyse or choose from this larger extract, not just a short extract, such as the sort of single paragraph that you might get for Paper 1. So you get more of an opportunity on this paper, this question, to cluster quotations and or group methods with similar effects. So this is a good opportunity for you to show your skills, and that's why the question is worth slightly more marks compared to the 8 marks for Paper 1. Now, in some cases, it may even ask you to look at a whole source, as I mentioned earlier, but that's the only difference. Otherwise, this question is the same. Because this is looking at what's called a literary non-fiction text, obviously it's not going to be a creation of a writer's imagination in the same way that the Paper 1 would be. However, nonetheless, the expectation is that a writer will be using very similar techniques in the way that they create the atmosphere that is described. But that's the only difference. It's not much of a difference, really. Now, it asks you to analyse the effects of the writer's use of language. Note, not form or structure. It's very important that you, for this question, that you clear those ideas out of your mind. Again, in terms of how to structure your response, to start with a single sentence introduction, which sums up the overall impression that the writer creates, would be a good idea. And I think, again, if you think about the writer's purpose, think about the kind of mood or the atmosphere that they are looking to create in this description, I think that's a very good approach. So you might begin by stating that in this section the writer creates a very relaxed and carefree atmosphere, for example. Again, that clearly wouldn't apply to the Aberfan extract, but that's the kind of thing that you might want to start with to sum up your overall response. Now, for those main paragraphs then that you'll write to analyse this, what I would suggest then is that you include the following elements. So a point, as mentioned, so something about what the writer does, clusters quotations, grouped terms where appropriate, or perhaps something like that, and then a detailed analysis of the writer's choices and why you think that they are significant. One of the things we've also mentioned before that might be appropriate for this is where you comment on the significance of keywords in a wider quotation. That's another strategy that you can use. So that's the kind of thing that you can see here, and we'll see on the next slide an example of what that might look like, but nothing too different, again, to what you've done before. One thing to mention, though, is that there are no marks for context here, so you don't really get much for putting this into perspective, but as long as you're thinking about the writer's purpose, what effects are they trying to achieve by choosing to describe it in this way, in this case the setting in this way. And for this question, I think 2 to 3 very detailed paragraphs would get you the marks. On question 2, I suppose it's 4 very short paragraphs, but here 2 to 3 more detailed ones is what's required. They're looking for some depth of analysis. So let's then actually look a bit more about what's requested of you. So in terms of the mark scheme, again, we'll look at what's required at the top of the level, because that's clearly what we're all aiming towards. So let's have a look, first of all then, at my notes down the left-hand side here, and we'll look at how they relate to the mark scheme. So for each section, we'll follow the arrows across. So notice it says how the top band criteria here emphasise. It mentions the range of textual detail, by which we're talking about clusters of quotations. And the idea of the judicious range, again, we're looking for short, sharp, pertinent quotations. Second bullet point, it talks about the sophisticated use of terms, i.e. things like grouped use of methods, or a wider technique followed by analysis of particular keywords, like particular verbs, for example, within that. That's the kind of thing we're talking about there. And finally, the last bullet point on my list, referring to the first bullet point on their list, this idea of the analysis of effects of the language deliberately used by the writer. And it comes back to that thing again, and I mentioned it, but I'll say it again. You have to think, don't you, that the writer has made these decisions on purpose for a particular reason, and so you have to decide what you think that purpose and reason is, and talk about it. And if you're doing that, you're on the right lines. So that's what we are talking about. And if you look at the top sentence, the very top sentence of that second column on this mark scheme, it talks about detailed and perceptive understanding of language. Well, if you're using the cluster of quotations, the groups of methods, and talking in detail about what's being done, clearly that will be detailed. And things like, we mentioned talking about things like atmosphere, for example, and why that is being used. If you're doing things like that, then that clearly will get you into the perceptive level. So that's what we're talking about there. Let's now look at an example of what that might actually look like in practice. So, again, I apologise for the handwriting, but nonetheless we can have a look at that. So this example paragraph here scored, it was from an answer which overall received 11 out of 12. This is just one paragraph, clearly, but it gives you a good indication. Again, it's from a different exam paper, but a very similar principle. So I'll read it to you. It says, one way Shelley uses language to convey her enjoyment is through religious imagery and metaphors. So see there, you have techniques, grouped techniques at that, and it's linked to the writer's purpose. Now some quotations integrated till soul became full to the brim with the sense of delight. So for this one, they've taken the approach of one longer quotation, which they're now going to dig into some key words of. So it says, this use of the term soul, it could have been more specific there, with the more precise in the use of term rather than term, could have said noun, for example. The term soul and description of how the beauty of the scene has something that emphasises her intense and passionate enjoyment of the visit. As another example of the religious language, it carries on the course assigned to it by the Creator. So another quotation there. This implies that the scene is so majestic and wonderful that it reflects God himself and could only have been made from his hands. This very strong positive description really emphasises her enjoyment and amazement at what she is experiencing. Now, to be honest, you might well think, and you might well be right, that this is not a particularly knockout paragraph. And certainly I think that all of you, really, from what I have seen in the past, would be capable of writing one that would be better than this. Certainly if, for example, you used more clusters of quotations or used some more precise use of terms, I actually think that you could do better than this. And I think if this were to sit the exam now, we might perhaps say that this answer would be a bit lucky to get as high as 11 out of 12. But nonetheless, you get an idea for the kind of thing that you could be talking about. Okay? What would I like you to do with this then? It would be useful, please, for you to just highlight the use of quotations and terms and analysis in this paragraph, perhaps in different colours or with different symbols, just so that you can see how it actually works. You'll also notice how, by the way, in terms of building detail, they build on the point further on in the sort of second section by when they add in the other full quotation, and that's a useful thing as well. Once you've done that, then, if you can please now, in a moment, have a go yourself at the question 3 for the Aberfan practice paper, so 2 to 3 paragraphs of your own. Now, as before, there are some example points on the next slide which you can use if you are stuck or because this is your first go. But if you feel confident and you're happy to leave those until after to look back at your work, that's absolutely fine. But anyway, if you can have a go at this 2 to 3 paragraphs, don't worry about time conditions as before, because this is the first run through. It's more important that you produce the amount than that you worry about the exact timing. So on the next slide here, this gives you some points that you might use and some terms that you might refer to. Again, though, your answer may include some of these, but the list is not definitive, so don't worry if you don't or didn't talk about any of those, but you could use those in your answer. Either way, you'll want to pause your presentation at this point so that you can actually get on with that answer, and that really covers that. When you finish that, you can move on then to some self-assessment for this question 3, very similar to what you did for question 2 on the previous video. So again, then, to compare the work that you just produced to the example paragraph, instructions and mark scheme in the preceding slides, and use all of these to decide on a mark for yourself. Now, as I said, I think, to be honest, I think that perhaps the paragraph example that we looked at might be perhaps really, in reality, maybe nearer a 9, perhaps than an 11. Maybe that mark that it got was a little bit generous, a little bit lucky. So I certainly think that you can all go beyond that. But again, if you can decide on a mark for yourself, write that mark on the bottom of your work along with a sentence explaining or justifying the mark that you've given. And again, is there anything that you think that you need to work on? Is there anything that, looking back at the example, you can see is perhaps a downside to your work? And that concludes question 3. Remember, of course, again, that once you've finished all these questions together, you'll be sending those through to me for me to be able to mark for you. With that, then, let's move on to question 4, the final section of these videos. So, question 4 is the most new, I think, out of all the questions on this paper. But once again, it's not particularly difficult. It's not really anything skill-wise that you haven't seen before. It's just about the way that it's put together. So, let's then look at what it asks us to do. Let's read the question first so that we get an idea. So, question 4 in the bottom corner of this sheet says, for this question, you need to refer to the whole of source A together with the whole of source B. So again, obviously emphasising the comparative nature of it, and if you follow the instructions, then you can't possibly get the wrong bit. It's useful, because it says the whole, it's useful to try and range across both texts, so don't just, for example, compare the beginnings of them. Try and get something in from, various points of the text. Let's see then what the actual question says. So it says, compare how the writers convey their different ideas and perspectives of the events that they describe. In your answer, you could compare their different ideas and perspectives. That's helpful, just in case you haven't worked that out from reading the question itself. You could compare the methods that they use to convey their ideas and perspectives, and support your response with references to both texts. Okay, now I think that there highlights a couple of interesting things. First of all, it mentions methods. Now, for some reason, on this question, there's a strange tendency that people have where they suddenly stop talking about methods. Very, very important to do that, but people don't. So that's an important mistake. Don't make it. Secondly, when it mentions methods, you'll notice it's methods plural, methods with an S. And that therefore takes us onto a point which I'll make in a moment, that we're not just talking about language here, we're talking about more than that. And then the final bullet point, support your response with reference, i.e. quotations from both texts. Again, sometimes people can let that slip. Obviously, I mean, you all know that quotations is the kind of non-negotiable, isn't it, really? So there we are. So, this question then, 16 marks, approximately 20 minutes. So it's the longest question in the reading section for paper 2. It's slightly shorter than the equivalent one, which is worth 20 marks on paper 1, but 16 marks is what you've got here. So, let's look then at my suggestions for how to go about this. Now, if question 2 was asking you to compare the impact of the sort of facts, the factual differences, question 4 on this paper is asking you to compare how the writer's opinions are presented differently. And again, as I've said before, we'll see more about what that looks like in a moment. But this is really what it's talking about when it talks about ideas and perspectives. You're looking at their different views of their different places. And because the two places are different, you will obviously have to be a little bit creative in terms of what that looks like. But it could be something like, for example, the first writer had a delightful time in their chosen location and viewed it as being a paradise on earth. That might be your first point, and the second one, it could be something along the lines of the second writer absolutely hated the time that they spent in their place, and they had a terrible time due to a range of factors. That's the sort of thing we're looking at as a kind of overview. Anyway, let's carry on. So, talk about a range of methods to hit the top band. So just like with English literature, you have to talk about more than just language. So language plus structure. Remember, structure, we're thinking about the kind of organisation of ideas in the text. You can think back to some of the ideas we've talked about for the English language question 3, for paper 1, that is to say, the structure question, for some inspiration for that. But thinking about the way that the writer has chosen to organise the text. And then finally, I think personally, if you can find something interesting to say about the impact for the differing forms of the text that you're looking at, I think that will be quite interesting. So if, for example, you can say anything interesting about the fact that one of them is a diary and another of them is an article or a letter or something like that, you might want to think about whether there's an impact in the fact that they're meant for a wider public audience or a more intimate audience, or in fact, in the case of a diary, for seemingly no audience at all, but as a kind of personal confessional for the writer. But if you could say a little something about that, it doesn't have to be very much, but I think that would be something that I would be looking for myself as a marker of a top band candidate. It could only be a sentence, but it just shows that you've got that breadth to really tick off the range of methods. Now, in terms of the structure of your response, once again, I would say a single sentence introduction, again, summing up your view of the differences between the two texts, I think is a good approach to do, rather like the example that I gave you just a second ago. I think something like that, very simple, very brief, but just showing straight away that you've got that grasp, that you understand the overview of what's different. Then, I've said on here perhaps 3 to 4 detailed and perceptive paragraphs. I think 3 would be ample, as long as they are hitting the marks. But ultimately, for these questions, particularly questions 3 and questions 4, in the end, what matters is not quite so much how many paragraphs you've got, but the quality of them. As long as you've got sort of 2 to 3, for question 3, 3 to 4 for this one. That's the sort of ballpark figure we're looking at. Now, once again, it may be helpful for you to think of this as a checklist in terms of things to include. A point at the beginning, some clustered quotations, grouped terms, detailed analysis of the writer's choices and why you think they're significant, perhaps commenting on the significance of keywords in a wide quotation. We've done this kind of thing before. You know how this sort of thing works. Okay, but in this case, you've got to make sure that you're answering the question. So in terms of how it refers to their ideas and perspectives, so how the methods that you've chosen relate to that. If you're saying that one of the writers is having a great time, how it shows that they're having a great time, and why. Why is it that they're trying to say that they're having a great time or not? You know, think about the writer's purpose. I think that's always important for these questions. The writer's purpose. Why have they chosen to do it? Now, in terms of the structure here, it's absolutely fine for this question, I think, to, and this is the last bit in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, absolutely fine to write a paragraph exploring one of the texts in detail, and then move on to write a paragraph on the second text in your next paragraph, but keep linking back to the first text. So, for example, you might be saying things like, in contrast to source A, or rather like in source B. So there isn't a need for you to do any kind of complex or elaborate sort of comparison where you're dancing around between texts and quoting from multiple texts together, unless you have a specific point that you want to make with that contrast. But there isn't a specific requirement you do it. It's perfectly acceptable to write about one text and then to write about the next text. And we'll look at an example of that in just a moment. Now, in terms of the mark scheme then, I have mentioned a few things that are worth talking about. So, apologies if I read this, but I think it's quite significant. It is useful to compare this mark scheme to the previous one for question 3, where that one referred to use of language, this one refers to methods. This confirms what I've already said, that you need to also refer to the structure of the text and perhaps also the form, if possible, e.g. is it significant if the text is written as letter, diary entry, etc., as mentioned. Otherwise, the two mark schemes are very similar, apart from the first bullet point, which emphasises how you need to compare the two articles. So there has to be some reference to them. As I was saying, that can be absolutely to write about one and then to make a comparison back to that in writing about the second one. However, if you think that there are something that is similar or that is interesting to talk about together, you can still talk about it in one paragraph. That you don't need to feel that you can't do that. The thing with comparisons is it's quite a difficult one to explain, if you like, because you have to respond to the texts that are in front of you, and it's very much down to what you think is appropriate. If you think that it's better, if they're very different, it's more likely that you'll be writing about one than the other. If there are some similarities, it may be more suitable for you to talk about them in a slightly more integrated way. But again, we'll have a look at an example of what it would look like, or what one approach would look like, in just a moment. So, as I said, the rest of the mark scheme I won't go into because it mentions very much the same ideas as the previous mark scheme. Right then, an example paragraph. Now, for this question, unfortunately, I couldn't find a good student example. So what we'll have to do is to focus on the top band extract from the mark scheme itself. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning here is notice how this is basically two separate paragraphs, one on each source, that have been bolted together, which, as I said, is a completely acceptable approach. And you'll see where the blue arrow points to that's where the writer stops talking about the first source and begins talking about the second source. So as I was saying, that's a perfectly acceptable way to do it. However, one way I do think that this could be improved is with a few more of the linking phrases between the two, such as the examples that I gave at the bottom of my instructions on slide 15. So things like, as with source A, similarly to source A, or in contrast to source A, that just dotted at intervals throughout the second half of this section. The other thing, as I was saying earlier, I think is that the comparison could have been perhaps a little bit more integrated if the writer of this answer had thought that was appropriate to do. But as I said, this works perfectly well and will get you into the top band, no problem at all. So let's just read through this then. So the writer of source A seems dispassionate at first, as he paints the picture of gloomy, isolated Aberfan as it lies tucked away from sight and mind. So again, point clearly linking to sort of the idea of moods and feelings again, sums up the portrayal of Aberfan, and straight away, short, pertinent quotation. You'll see then now, we've got some language analysis. The verb tucked is more usually associated with being tucked up in bed and tends to have more positive connotations of safety and warmth. But here, the writer uses it differently. So this is where it starts to get more perceptive. So it's looking at the way that the writer perhaps subverts our expectations, does things that the reader wouldn't expect. But here the writer uses it differently, perhaps to imply complacency. He reinforces this view when he creates the sense of a malevolent killer stalking its victims. He sees this disaster as cruel and a shame on God and man. See there the clustered, short, pertinent quotations. Also, I like that phrase, he reinforces this view. That's a good phrase for building on a point that you've already made. So in terms of building detail, I think phrases like that are good to use. It continues then with some more analysis. This time, the emotive connotations of shame linked with God suggest a biblical connection as with the shaming of sinners. Now, you don't necessarily need to say much about that because that's quite a contextual point, but it does help to elaborate on what's being said. It now then, with that signposting phrase in contrast, moves on to talk about source B. So it says, in contrast, the writer of source B mocks the idea of the earthquake, which seems so minor it was hardly noticed in London. One method he uses is exaggeration. Of course, being good literature students, you would all substitute that for hyperbole. But where he describes the incident out of all proportion, with the Midlands, for example, where it nearly broke crockery. The reference to broken crockery is hardly momentous, yet through it the writer cleverly understates the threat at this point, something he escalates later in his report when he asks the rhetorical question, who can say what strange trial may await us? Now, as I've said before for question 2, the use of the ellipsis there is very useful because, again, it's sophisticated use of quotation. It's missing out the irrelevant bit in the middle. It saves you time in the exam, so it's all-round good practice. But when it mentions, for example, there about understating the threat, something he escalates later, we're talking about structure. We're looking at the way that the writer has chosen to organise their ideas. And of course, in any text in the exam, they will always be chosen with an eye to there being changes. No text will simply write about one thing in a uniform mood for all its time. There are going to be changes, there are going to be falters, there are going to be differences, increases, decreases, diminuendos, crescendos. There are going to be effects that you can identify. Anyway, to continue then with the rest of this text, here the reference to trial reveals the writer's view of the potential dangers a future earthquake might bring. Just as the defendant is put on trial for life, so he seems to imply that next time a similar earthquake might lead to loss of lives and such should be taken more seriously. Now, overall, this is a very well written answer. It's got a lot of analysis, which I think is where it scores highly. The one thing I think perhaps it could do is it could use a slightly more forensic, slightly more detailed use of terms. So, for example, when it talks about the reference to trial in this last section here, it could say, for example, something like the reference to the noun trial or the metaphor trial, perhaps. This is what I mean when I say that it could make slightly more detailed use of terms. And as I said earlier, it could also make slightly more links back, things like unlike in source A, but you get the general idea. Overall, this is the kind of thing we're looking for, and this would, I think, comfortably be something like 14 out of 16. Now that you've done this, now that you've seen what an answer would look like, and now that you have had a look at the mark scheme and think about the instructions, again, as previously, if you can be prepared to have a go at doing this yourself. Now, I know this example is for the Aberfan paper, So you'll have to find another 2 or 3 additional points of comparison yourself. Now, to help you with that, on the next slide, if you need it, again, I have got some example ideas that you could refer to. If you don't feel the need to look at those example ideas, fine, but because this is your first time doing this paper, if you would prefer to do that, prefer to have a look at them before you actually start writing, then by all means do. I won't read them out, but they are on the next slide. Okay, as usual, there are possible points. The first list here includes some possible points in comparison. The second list includes some possible methods that you could refer to. I haven't given you here any real ideas in terms of the analysis you might derive from that, so I'm going to leave you to think about that some more. As usual, neither list is exhaustive, so you may have other ideas. But there are a few ideas here that perhaps are worth just drawing on. When it mentions about what the purpose is of each text, we've talked about that, the writer's different intentions, what impact the writer intends to have on the reader. The fact that it may have no impact on you is irrelevant. You have to think about what a writer might have been trying to achieve. In terms of the methods, now you'll see there that not all of the methods that are referred to here are necessarily specific terms that we've talked about. Something like, for example, scientific terminology, that's not a literary term, it's not a metaphor or something. Although you could talk about, for example, a semantic field of scientific terms. But what I think that is useful there is it demonstrates that sometimes you'll pick out features of a text that might not have a specific name, but nonetheless they will be interesting things that you can talk about. So it mentions language there, we've got that. It mentions structure, so things like the sequence of events, the narrative focus. Does that shift and why? Sentence structures, sometimes you can talk about things like pacing with sentence structures. It's not always easy to make very profound points, so often perhaps that's best bolted onto something else, but nonetheless you can talk about that. Any shifts of tense or focus. And finally, thinking about the tone, as we were saying before, about comparing moods and atmospheres, or tone, which is very much the same kind of idea. I think things like that are very, very useful for these kind of questions. Hopefully, anyway, that will be something that will help you. As before, and if you can make sure that you have done your paragraphs for this question now in your own time, pausing this presentation. When you've done that, you can then do the self-assessment task for this question. So once again, it asks you to compare the work that you've just produced, the example paragraph, for the instructions, and for the mark scheme in the preceding slides, and use all of those to decide on a mark for yourself, bearing in mind that the example we looked at there was probably about 14 out of 16. So write your mark at the bottom of your work and a sentence explaining it. Once again, is there anything that you think you need to work on? Make sure that you've done that. Now, final thing then is, don't forget, once you've completed all of your answers, once you've completed this presentation and made sure that your notes are up to speed, don't forget now to email me your answers to questions 2, 3 and 4 to Mark, and including obviously with that the self-assessment that you've done for each question. Now, if you prefer not to type it, you could alternatively handwrite it and scan it, or send it as photos if you prefer to do it that way. But again, as I said at the start of this presentation, what's really important is that you keep all this work together in sequence. In the same way that you had the really detailed set of notes going over a number of lessons and even weeks when we did paper 1 questions, section 8 questions, you'll be needing to use this in exactly the same way. So don't, whatever you do, don't lose this or whatever. I mean, even perhaps email it to yourself so that you've got it somewhere where if your laptop blows up, then you can still get it. However you do it, it would be very useful. Print it, or perhaps print it, or in the future print it when you get back to school, whichever way around, but please make sure that you have got an accurate record of all of this work. That concludes the video for questions 3 and 4, and therefore it concludes my introduction to paper 2 section A. So thank you for that.